Okay, so the broadcast has started. You're going to have about a 15-second countdown. There we go live in about 15 seconds. 10. I'll count down from 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're live, Evan.
Hello, I'm Evan Brooks, and this is my talk. What is a game designer? So to get started, I just want to do a bit about myself. So I am a game designer too, working at FUNCOM. I have about 12 years of experience in game development, including professional studio work, contract work, and also just hobbyist and community projects. I graduated from North Carolina State University with a Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration and Information Technology. And listed here is a few of my projects that I've done. So I've split this presentation into what I call levels. So level 1 is what is a game designer. Level 2 is what does a game designer do. Level 3 is how do I become a game designer. And sprinkled throughout are gifts from there's new animated series from Halo. Halo is my all-time favorite game series. So if you don't like Halo, I apologize in advance. So what is a game designer? To answer this question, compared to me, those given conversations started together. I think this is a meme. I'm not a meme designer, I'm a game designer. And what I try to convey with this meme is that I think a lot of people misconceptions about what game designers actually do. I've had people think I'm an engineer, a programmer, I've had people think I'm an artist, people who think I do everything. And bits and pieces of those are the truth, valid, and the truth. So I want to get started with what I'm calling the boring answer, and then we'll get to the fun answer. So bear with me, this one's going to be a little bit wordy, but that's why it's the boring answer. So a game designer is someone who applies creative and analytical intelligence through an iterative and collaborative design process to ideate, prototype, and implement engaging interactive experiences within constantly evolving constraints. And that's a boring answer, but what that really means is part of a game designer's job is to do a lot of critical thinking and analyzing different kinds of design problems from all kinds of perspectives, and then coming up with solutions and applying them, and also working together with other people to do so. So that's great, but here's the fun answer. A game designer is someone who loves making video games just as much as playing them and works together with others to bring their imagination to life. So as you can see here, we've plugged a controller into a throbbing heart, because that's literally what being a game designer looks like, a big blue throbbing heart. And what that really means is it's important to love playing video games just as much as you love making them, and vice versa. So let's quickly talk about 5 traits that I think a game designer should have. There's probably a million traits you should have, but these are some that I think are the most valuable. So first up is you have to be a gamer. You have to love playing games. They have to be your biggest hobby. And that's important because playing a lot of games is what helps you understand what makes them work and why they're worth experiencing. Number 2 is to be creative. You have to be able to think up ideas from out of nowhere, or even think of ways to expand upon existing ideas. And it's that kind of ideation and imaginative process that allows you to continuously push a game forward. You have to be analytical. A lot of design is about assessing a problem and looking at it from all kinds of different perspectives. Like if you have a cube, you know it has 6 sides, and as a designer, you need to look at each side and understand what you're looking at and why it matters. You'll need to be collaborative. I think there's a misconception that I see a lot online sometimes, is that game designers are the idea people. And sometimes that can be true. We do come up with a lot of ideas, but very often those ideas are also part of a collaborative process, including brainstorms. Everyone on a development team has unique experiences and perspectives that can offer a lot. And it's important to work together with people to make those things happen. And lastly, it's super important to be inquisitive. The games industry is constantly evolving, it's ever changing, and you kind of need to be a lifelong learner and student. And it's really important to just make sure that you're always keeping up to date on the latest in gaming trends and technology.
So let's talk a little bit about different kinds of specializations in game design. So I'm not going to run through this whole list because there's a lot of them, but kind of the top three most broad specializations would probably be a game designer, a level designer, and a technical designer. So game designers, probably the most general, and they might do anything from prototype and implement like camera or character movement, weapons, combat, platforming mechanics, anything like that. Then a level designer, their job is to make the play spaces that help implement the gameplay. So for example, in Mario, a level designer would make your favorite platforming level, and the game designer makes the mechanics that help players move through the level. So like Mario's iconic jump and the question mark blocks you jump into. And then technical designers, they'll usually have some kind of scripting or programming experience that can kind of bridge the gap between a designer and a programmer to help actually implement features that are designed. And there's many, many more specializations, but it's important to think about these might not be universal between development teams. So very often that is based on the size of the studio or team. So a larger studio will quite often have more of these granular specialized roles, whereas a smaller studio or team will have more general roles. So if you have a team of 5 people, they might have one designer who's also the programmer. If you have a team of 50 people, they might have 2 game designers and 3 level designers. And then if you are making Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty, you might have a team of 30 level designers and systems designers and economy designers and people working solely on multiplayer or user experience. So it really depends. So that's kind of a broad overview of what a game designer is, but another important part of that question is, what does a game designer actually do? That was a nice water plot. So we'll talk a little bit about the design process. And if you were to Google this, you'd probably find a million different answers because design is something not solely found in game development. There's product design and industrial design, like people who design cars or the iPhone. But as it relates to game development, I've kind of outlined what I think are the core parts of this process. So the first part is research and competitive analysis. The second part, brainstorming and ideation. The third part, prototyping and implementation. 4, playtesting and feedback. And 5, iteration and validation. And these kind of work together in a cycle. And you'll often find that this cycle repeats through the entire course of development, both on a project level and at the level of like individual features and mechanics. So you might imagine if you're working on that Mario level, you might iterate on that level multiple times throughout the process as you learn more about it, what works, what doesn't work. And if you're making the next Call of Duty game, you're going to continue to iterate on what you learned from the previous game. So now we'll go a little bit more in depth to each of these steps and describe what they are. So first up, research and competitive analysis. So this is basically playing games, but getting paid to do so, which is kind of cool, but it's also more than that. So the purpose of doing research is to explore the in and outs of competitors' games. So games are a product that competes on a market. And in order to be successful, you have to do something different than your competitors or do something better than your competitors. So it's important to recognize what your game is, where it is, and how it adds value. So for example, if you're playing the latest Fallout game and you really enjoy its combat, well, why is it great? Can we do it better? If you're playing the latest puzzle game on your phone, is it not very good? Can you fix it? Does it have potential? So understanding your competitors is the key to surpassing them. You often see many top-tier games kind of jockeying for position. I think most recently the Battle Royale genre, which has just exploded, is a perfect example of this, just like the MOBA genre was before this. And it's important in this process that we're documenting and analyzing our findings so we can use it for reference. As an example, I've been working on some combat stuff at work recently, and I've recorded many videos of combat mechanics in other games, and I just kind of have a library of different mechanics. So I'll have several videos from various games for each mechanic, and I can look at those, compare them to what I'm working on, and decide, how do I want to be different? How do I want to be similar? And where can I make the most value? So next we'll talk about brainstorming and ideation. So this is the part where you get to be the idea person. So brainstorming is all about finding answers to design problems and questions. So if you want to know, how can the player feel powerful? Well, it doesn't happen automatically. You're going to have a plan for that. In the case of Mario, jumping is something that feels exciting and engaging, and it makes Mario feel special. And then a question like, why would the player visit the castle? They're not going to visit it just because it's a castle. They're going to visit it because it's enticing, and there's something to be found there. There's something to discover. There's something exciting. And just like with researching, it's important to document and organize these ideas. And this can often come in the form of brainstorming and like typing up a note document, or whiteboarding, taking a picture of the whiteboard, making mind maps, anything like that. And oftentimes the best ideas will kind of arise from these kinds of brainstorms where you have, as I mentioned before, so many different people from different backgrounds and perspectives. And for example, if you're someone that only plays shooter games and RPGs, and you have another person on your team that is a big fan of racing games, well, maybe if you're making a game that's a shooter, you might think they might not have good ideas. But because they might not typically be a shooter player, they're going to have a unique perspective. And if they can find something to enjoy in your game, as someone that doesn't normally play that kind of game, that's really valuable, and that's something you should pay attention to. And then the best ideas will usually need to be pitched to a lead or director and get approved for implementation. Making features is not cheap. Coming up with ideas is cheap, and not every idea gets to become a feature. So let's talk about that actual implementation. Prototyping ideas allows designs to be tested. Not every idea is going to work. And quite often you'll find that the idea on paper sounds really great, but in practice, it's not that great. So maybe you had the idea that you can fly on a giant snail through space, but then when you actually implement it, you find out that really you're just crashing through asteroids all the time and going really slow, and you can't turn quite right. And you find out, man, this isn't really fun. So this part of the process lets us ask, well, why is it not fun? Or why is it fun? And you can take that and expand upon it. And when that's the case, you'll find that the most outstanding prototypes are going to be your candidates for implementation. If they're not, then they're probably going to be cut. Like I said, making features is expensive. There's a cost of time and manpower, and there's just not room to do everything. Even the biggest, most bombastic, expensive games have massive amounts of cut features. Very seldom do features that actually release in a game are actually the original vision. They're usually pared down in some way. So let's talk about how we actually determine if something's good or not. Playtest and feedback. Playtesting allows our designs to be validated. Like we said with the paper design versus the actual implementation, an idea and reality are different things. And again, ever important, is it fun, is it not, and why? And this feedback is critical to effectively assessing designs. And like I mentioned with, for example, if you're making a shooter game, the person that likes kart racers, they're gonna have different kinds of feedback than someone who typically plays shooter games, and all of it's important. And sometimes you'll run into a problem, however, where the source of the feedback is different than what the person giving the feedback thinks it is. So for example, if you go on pretty much any forum for a popular game, you might see players say things like, well, weapon X is really overpowered, or ability Y is really underpowered. And they're coming from a good place and they're expressing something that they feel is important, but oftentimes that might not always be the case. As game designers and developers, we usually have all of the information, whereas other people are working with bits and pieces of it. So we might find that, okay, they say that this item is too expensive. Well, when we look at the economy, we find out it actually just feels that way because like 5 other items in that category aren't priced correctly, or weapon X feels underpowered because weapon Y is too powerful. So whenever you get feedback, it's important to take a step back, look at it at face value, but then try working around it and seeing the different angles from which it might be interpreted. And then lastly, iteration and validation. So designs are developed over time through iteration. Just like we mentioned again with the paper prototype, maybe it doesn't work out quite right, or maybe it does. And if it does, you're going to want to iterate on it. And iteration is the process where you kind of work out the kinks, so to speak, or smooth out the rough edges. So maybe something has potential and it's not quite there, but over time you start to develop it and you take advantage of that feedback and you say, okay, well, if we tweak this and we tune that, then maybe we'll have something better, and you keep testing. And these are often fairly granular iterations. If it's more sweeping, a bigger iteration, that's probably indicative of a larger problem. And these should always be informed. It's not great, in my opinion, to kind of idly tweak things. There is a cost to our work. And if you're just kind of hanging out thinking, oh, well, what if I did this? There's a time and a place for that. But in iteration, it's important to make sure that you're acting on information and like critical feedback. And again, with the play testing, these subsequent iterations need to be play tested to make sure you're actually going in the right direction. It is possible through iteration that you actually take a step backwards. So you want to keep play testing to be sure that you are indeed moving forward. And eventually, after enough time, or you run out of time, enough positive feedback will validate any of your designs. So that's kind of a rough overview of the design process and kind of moving through the stage of coming up with ideas, then prototyping them, play testing, getting feedback, and then continuing to iterate and validate. But there's some other parts of design, and I'm going to go through kind of a high-level overview of some of the most important things we work with. And one of those is design constraints. So a constraint is defined as a limitation or restriction. And these exist all throughout our design process, from the earliest stages to the latest stages. And sometimes these can be fairly flexible, or they can be more stringent. So for example, you might have a cube and you have to work inside of the cube. More flexible constraints might allow you to push one wall of that cube out a little bit. But if it's more stringent, you're kind of stuck. There's no room to breathe. You can't make the cube bigger, you can't make it smaller, you can't change how it works. And these can either be provided to us or created. So we might get a constraint from a director or executives or even a marketing team, and they might say, well, this game is rated T for teen, or this game is intended for people ages 4 through 7, or this game is in the kart racer genre. Or we can create our own constraints. For example, if you think of a game like Overwatch, the heroes have a certain number of abilities. No hero has like 20 abilities. They all have 3 or 4. And that's an example of a constraint we create for ourselves. Although that is kind of in part to the number of buttons on a controller. And that's another great example is with the keyboard, you have so many keys. With the controller, not so much. And there's also a limit on what the user can actually competently experience with the controller. You can't expect a user to know that every key on the keyboard equals a different ability and remember that. And probably the most important part of constraints is that designers work within constraints and we discover ways to manipulate them. So if I go back to the cube example, you can't make the cube bigger, you can't change how it works, but you can change what you do inside of it. So if you're building a level and it has to fit within these dimensions, you might first create something that exists on a 2D plane. And okay, that only takes up X amount of space. We're not really taking full advantage of what we have available. So then you might make something that kind of works in the 3D space and you can go up and left and over. Now you're taking up more of the space, and that's great. You filled up the cube, but you could do more. You could make a level that transforms and swaps between different play spaces. So now instead of one level that exists in the space of the cube, you could have 100 or 1,000, but it all still fits within that cube. So this is the sad slide in many ways. Target audience. So a professional game designer does not make games for themselves, but for a targeted audience. And I want to put a little asterisk next to this because it is important that we are part of that audience. So if we're making a kart racer, maybe we're not the biggest fan of Mario Kart or Crash Team Racing, but it is important that we can put ourselves in the shoes of that audience and understand why people who like those games enjoy them. So it's important to research that audience, to analyze them, understand, support, and empathize with them. It wouldn't do well to be a game designer working on something and absolutely just hate it, because that's not going to make for a very good game. You're going to be miserable, and the people who play it are probably not going to like a lot of the choices you've made. So again, if you're playing a kart racer, if you're making a kart racer, you should play a kart racer. Put yourselves in the shoes of the people who love Mario Kart and build a game for them. And part of that understanding the audience also plays into motivational psychology, which is a huge topic, of course, that this talk is not about. But it is an important part of work we do as designers. So to make a game for a specific audience, you have to understand that audience and why they play our games. And a great example of this is what's called the player experience of need satisfaction, or PINS, which is just kind of like a framework for understanding some of the psychological motivators for players. So there's 3 parts of this framework: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy is the opportunity for players to express control and agency in a game. So it's the player's ability to press A and jump in Mario, or it's the player's ability to customize their character in Fallout and really role play and feel like they're part of the world. And then competence is the ability for players to express mastery. I think the Souls games are a perfect example of this. Nothing gets in the way of players expressing their skill. And an example of a game that doesn't really allow competence would be something where the player is trying to get better, but the game's constantly putting them down, and it doesn't really allow them to feel as though they've mastered anything. So again, with Dark Souls, when players beat that big bad boss, they feel really powerful and they've really earned it. Everyone knows it's a challenge to play through those games, and you have to be very precise with combat in that game. So when you do it well, you've earned it. And then lastly, relatedness is how people feel about non-player characters in games or other players in multiplayer games, and their ability to connect and relate with them and just feel a connection with others. And these 3 things are really big motivations for players, and it kind of helps us understand some of the things that make games compelling and what makes them fun. And of course, there's a bit of art and there's a bit of science here, but we're learning more all the time. And these are important parts of just understanding how and why players play our games. So now that we've kind of talked about some of what a game designer does, I just want to give a brief look at kind of what a day in the life is. So for me, in the morning, I usually start at around 8:30. And for FUNCOM specifically, our main studio is in Oslo, Norway. So that means I have about a 6-hour time difference with a lot of people I work with. So in the morning, I like to start a little bit earlier than 9 and just kind of follow up with what I've missed out on over the past, or while I was asleep, I guess. After that, I have a brief stand-up with my team, which is where we just kind of talk about what we did previously and what we're going to be doing today. After that, I like to do just like a quick review of my tasks. What did I do yesterday and what I'm going to be doing today? Is there anything that needs higher priority? Is there anything I can bump till tomorrow? Then I finally get to do some work, and Usually, actually, there's probably a lot of meetings, so it kind of depends on the week. Sometimes there's definitely more meetings than work. And after a morning of meetings or work, I usually have lunch with my coworkers. Either we go somewhere or I hang out in the break room. Then, in the afternoon, I usually try to follow up on anything I missed over lunch, or things that I didn't have time for in the morning. Oops, I think I missed my slide. There we go. And after that, usually I finally have more free time to do my tasks, because a lot of the people I work with are in Oslo. A lot of my meetings are between people in the American office and the Oslo office. So those meetings usually happen in the morning. So in the afternoon, I usually have a bit more free time for my actual work. Then at 3 o'clock, we have kind of a regular play test that my team at least does every day. I think that's super important to be regularly play testing the game and see the work you're doing in context of the game itself. And then after that, I usually finish up my work for the day and kind of wind things down and get ready for tomorrow, which I think is pretty important, is just making sure that I leave off at a good spot where I can get back to an easy start the next day and kind of understand what I'm doing. And I can't confirm how accurate this diagram is, but this is like my rough approximation of how my work is broken down in a week. So I've kind of suggested that maybe there's 35% meetings in a week, 5% play testing, and 60% actual design work. And if you break out the design work part, you'll see that prototyping and ideation are the biggest parts of my work, or my bad, prototype and iteration, and ideation, playtesting, and research all make up a smaller part. And going back to the meme I shared at the beginning, a lot of people don't quite understand what this work looks like. So here's a quick show and tell of some of the stuff I worked on. These are all from personal projects, but on the top left, I have a video playing of a prototype I made of a game with characters, abilities, enemies. On the top right, I have some pictures from my personal design journals where I write notes and ideas. On the bottom left and bottom right, I have pictures of some levels I've worked on. So on the left is kind of a picture of different iterations of a level, from earliest iteration to a later iteration. And on the right, I have a picture from the very first block out of a level all the way to the final product. So level 3, how do I become a game designer? The advice I'll give everyone is to just make something. Experience in game design comes from actually designing games. If you have an idea, you should try to create it in any way you can. And this could be a physical prototype, it could be a virtual prototype. In terms of physical, it could be anything from using pieces of cardboard or Legos or action figures. I know a few board game designers who do just that. They make their own cards using pieces of paper, index cards, boards out of cereal boxes, stuff like that. In terms of virtual prototypes, it could be anything from making an animation in Photoshop to blocking out something in a modeling program to programming or scripting. And the one thing I always try to make very clear is, if you're going to do this, you should start small. Try making a game with a single mechanic. I very often see people bite off way more than they can chew because everyone wants to make their dream game. And it takes one look at the Unreal Engine forums to see someone who wants to make the next giant open world zombie survival MMO. But people who are just starting out, yes, it's great that you want to make that, but it becomes very apparent very quickly just what a big ask that is. And the problem with biting off more than you can chew is that you won't finish it. And when you don't finish, you're not going to feel very good about it. But if you do finish something, it's a huge confidence booster. Finishing and releasing a project is so exciting, and it brings so much pride. You're able to package something up, look at it, and say, I made that. And I cannot overstate the value of that. So after you make something, you should share it. Sharing work and collecting feedback is critical to growing as a designer. If you don't take in any feedback at all, positive, negative, doesn't matter, you'll never succeed as a designer, because being a designer means making things that don't always work. And it's important to get that feedback. And if you're just kind of acting alone, you'll never understand when something works or doesn't, because it might always feel like it works to you, but you won't know if it works for everyone or who you're making it for until they actually give you that feedback. So if a project's ready, you should get it in front of people. And that doesn't necessarily mean they have to play it. It could be on a portfolio website, videos or pictures. It could be on social media, like on a forum, Reddit, which is a scary place at times, but it can also be a great place to get feedback. Or if you're feeling brave enough, you can release it and you can let people play. And great ways to do that might be releasing it on websites like itch.io or IndieDB. And one of the most important things to me is to always be designing. There's always a new idea, and it's always worth exploring it, even if it's just writing down the idea quickly in a notebook and then thinking a little bit about it. And I like to call this homework, but it is fun. So it's important for designers to experience stuff, whether that's playing an existing game or something new that you're creating. It's important to analyze those things. So if you are playing a game, think about it. Why does it work? Why does it not work? Why is it fun? Why is it not fun? Imagine, what's your next game? What could a game you're playing do better? And create. Actually make the thing you're thinking of. Hop into Unity, Unreal, Photoshop, Blender, actually make stuff. And those are kind of like the four main parts of how to always be designing. Just keep that creativity going. And going back to something I said earlier, always be learning. It's important to be a lifelong student. And part of that is starting to understand the different parts of game development. Designers, of course, are not the only discipline in game development. There's artists, there's engineers, there's writers, and games are made from a lot of input from all these specializations. And each of these adds value, and each is relevant to design. Just like I've talked about before with collaboration, all these parts work together to create the whole. And as a designer, I feel it's important to augment your design skills with knowledge in these art specializations. You don't have to be a master of everything, but there's a lot of value to be earned from maybe you're a designer and you do a little bit of art. Maybe you're a designer and you do a little bit of programming. For myself, I like to learn so much about all these different things. And I do some art, I do some programming, and I find all the time that I get to take advantage of those extra skills I've learned in my work. And I'm always thankful that I've taken the time to explore those different specializations. And another added benefit is you'll be more competent in talking with your coworkers who do those different things. You'll be able to kind of speak the same language and understand that, for example, if a programmer has a concern about how something works, if you don't know anything about programming, you might not understand why they're concerned. But if you do, you might be able to have a more intelligent discussion with them and more easily come to a compromise or solution. And the last thing I'll touch on is education. The best education is just making games. Like I mentioned, always be making stuff, always be sharing stuff, always be designing. And there are degree programs for schools that offer this kind of experience. It's not necessarily a requirement though. Many of my coworkers are more veterans and they didn't grow up in a time where those kinds of educations were even an option. So again, none of my coworkers really have like a design degree, but they all got experience kind of in the same way I did by just starting out working on community projects and kind of our own personal endeavors. And even if you were to go to school and get this kind of experience, I think it's important to branch out and do things on your own, find your own projects to work on or other teams to be a part of. One of the most valuable experiences I had was joining a team of modders who were making a mod for a game, Unreal Tournament 3. And some of the people on the team were actually professionals in the industry. And they were able to provide mentorship with me and really accelerate my growth as a designer and artist. And it's probably worth pointing out that most game developers do have some form of higher education, and you'd be surprised how many of them have a degree that's not relevant at all to what they do. So if you do want to pursue an education, I'd say just think about what adds the most value for you and how can you use that to pursue your own goals and what feels comfortable. You shouldn't feel pressured to do anything you don't think will add value for you. And lastly, briefly touch on being a professional game developer versus being a hobbyist. So designing video games is an amazing job, but it's important to remember that it is actually a job, which means that it does come with all the real pressures of a job, including deadlines, budgets, reviews. But it's worth pointing out that a career in passion adds immeasurable value to life. In many ways, it's something not everyone gets to experience, but it's something I would encourage everyone to go for. But it is important to balance your career goals with your personal goals, your needs and wants. It might not be the right fit for everyone. And maybe you'd be better off doing it as a hobby. Like I mentioned in a previous slide about target audience, very often we're making games not for ourselves, but for a target audience, which means we lose some of our kind of creative integrity almost, in that you have these constraints and you don't get total creative freedom. So for some people, that's going to be a problem. And if that's the case, then they should probably be a hobbyist and focus on what makes them the most happy. But the amazing thing about being a professional game designer and working in studios is that you get to achieve something that's so much more greater than what you could do alone or with a small team. And with that, that's pretty much my talk. So thank you for listening, taking a look. And if you have any questions or comments, or you just want to talk about game development, feel free to reach me at my email, evanb@funcom.com, or feel free to put me on LinkedIn at evanbrooks72. Thank you.